Chapter 9. One afternoon, a few weeks later, the younger boys were finishing their chores in the barn. "Let's hurry over to the field," Jonas urged. "Not much of the football season is left, and we don't have much daylight either," said Iggy. "Truly, the sun goes to bed earlier and earlier every day." "Oh, Jimmy," someone called from the milking room. Mr. Hoyt, who ran the school farm, walked in. "Jimmy, you're wanted in Mr. Pierce's office right away." "Yes, sir." Jimmy wondered why the superintendent wanted him. What could it be? The other boys went out with him. "What have you done wrong?" asked Jonas. "Did you mash someone's marbles?" teased Iggy. Jimmy couldn't think of any reason. "I just don't know." He sprinted away from his two companions, and he dashed up the steps of the office and knocked at Mr. Pierce's door. "Come in," the superintendent called. He had a yellow paper in his hand. "Oh, Jimmy, I want to talk to you about something." Just then, Mr. Plank, who was in charge of discipline, poked his head around the door. "Could you step out here a minute, Mr. Pierce?" "I'll be right back," the superintendent said. Jimmy was surprised and was worried when he saw Mr. Plank. "Uh-oh," he thought. "I must have done something wrong." He tried to guess what it could be. He looked at the yellow paper on Mr. Pierce's desk. Could it tell me anything? Jimmy's curiosity got the better of him, and he picked up the paper, and it was a telegram. "Please send Jimmy home. His father badly hurt. Hunting accident. Charlotte Thorpe." Jimmy read it again before he could believe it. Not Pa. He was so big and strong. Like a knife in his heart, Jimmy remembered Charlie, and then there was only one thought that came to his mind. "I've got to get home." He dashed out the door, down the steps, around the circle he ran, and he didn't stop until he reached the railway station in Lawrence. A freight train to the southwest was pulling out, and Jimmy grabbed the iron rails on the side of one car and pulled himself up. A few minutes later, the train jerked to a stop. Jimmy jumped down and looked around. Up ahead, the locomotive was taking on water from a tank beside the tracks. Jimmy didn't see any open doors on the freight car, but at the end he saw a narrow ledge. He crawled up and he stretched out, and the train jerked again and started. Jimmy held on to the rough boards. He couldn't sleep a wink all night. The noise of the wheels clacking over the iron rail was almost deafening. He had to hold on tight. Twice, when the train lurched, he almost lost his grip. Only his unusual strength kept him from falling. "I know now why it's dangerous to hop a freight train," he said to himself, "but I've just got to get home." As morning came, the train pulled into Wichita, Kansas, and Jimmy would have to start walking now. The train went on west, but home was nearly due south. He knew because he'd heard Pa talk about Wichita. He set off. Tired as he was, he jogged all day. He drank from the streams along the way. He ate dry berries and bark, and that night he lay down on a little hollow beside a river, and he fell asleep instantly. As it grew late on the fourth day of his journey, Jimmy knew he was near home. He recognized the woods where he had hunted, and he urged his legs on, trotting faster as night fell. It was very late when he reached the familiar clearing, and he dreaded what he might find. Then he spied someone. Pacing in front of the cabin, clear in the moonlight, was a familiar figure. Jimmy's heart jumped. It was Pa! Big Hiram Thorpe had one arm in a sling, and he looked thin and worried. "Pa, you're all right!" Jimmy ran to throw his arms around his father. "Jimmy, where'd you come from?" "I ran home as fast as I could." "You ran home?" "Well, I rode a freight train part of the way." "My son, that's dangerous. You shouldn't have done that, even though you were so worried." Jimmy told his father about the journey, and Mr. Thorpe looked at the small figure, and he thought of the many miles from Haskell. "But Jimmy, the school would have paid your train fare home." "Oh, I never thought of that. I just had to start at once. Were you hurt badly?" "It's nothing." Mr. Thorpe glanced at the sling. "My arm was broken and torn a little, but there's really some bad news, and it's about your mother." "Ma?" "She has blood poisoning. I've taken her to the hospital, but the doctor says she cannot recover, and there's no hope." Jimmy was crushed. Just when he had found Pa was all right, Ma was sick and not going to get well. He could not believe it. "It's so hard, my son, but we must be brave. Rest now. We'll go in the morning to see her." Jimmy thought he would never close his eyes. His mind was a whirl, but he was so tired he finally dropped off to sleep. In his dreams, he fought through a thick forest, trying to find a path, and great clouds hid the sun. He could see nothing bright ahead of him. In the weeks that followed, everything seemed wrong to Jimmy. Home was not home, with his mother gone, first Charlie and now Ma. Even the river and the woods seemed unfriendly. All the children had gone back to the Sack and Fox Agency School except George and Jimmy. George was 16 now, and Pa wanted him to help on the farm. Jimmy worked hard at the chores, and he hoped Pa would let him stay on too. But one day in the barn, Mr. Thorpe said, It's time we start talking about your schooling. Do you want to go back to Haskell?" No, sir. Jimmy could never forget that terrible day in Mr. Pierce's office. "So be it," Mr. Thorpe said. "Tomorrow you must start in the new school district." "But, Pa, you need me on the farm. Or I could work on a ranch somewhere." "Jimmy, a lad 12 years old should be in school. Your mother would want that. The new school is only 3 miles away. You can still help me here after school." Jimmy didn't say anything. He stared at his father. He didn't really mind going to school, but he felt all mixed up. Nothing seemed right. Big Hiram Thorpe looked at his small son. He knew how Jimmy had suffered. He didn't want it to be too hard on him. "It's about time you learned to ride with the wild colts," he said in a kindly way. "Pa, do you think my path will ever be bright again?" "Of course, son. Remember, put one foot before the other, one step at a time, and your first step should be back towards school." For the next 3 years, Jimmy studied hard. If Black Hawk could meet defeat with honor and lead our tribe through many misfortunes, surely I too can be brave. He missed all the sports he had enjoyed at Haskell. Here everyone went home after classes. Jimmy hunted and fished, and sometimes with Pa, sometimes with George, but more often alone. He would jog along for hours looking after his traps and trailing game. Once again the woods seemed friendly. He learned more and more about the ways of animals, and he brought home more game than George. He was almost as good a hunter as his father. He learned to tame the wild colts that kicked up their heels in the corrals. He could do a man's work on the farm any day. He grew as strong as one of the wildest broncos off the range, but he didn't grow any larger. Often he thought about Haskell and about Chauncey and the teams and their games. "If I'm ever a great chief," he said to himself, "I guess it won't be in sports." Many times he wondered about those words he had heard long ago. "All our people think you are like Black Hawk. We named you Wathohuk, which means bright path." And every time he wondered, he knew he must still take one step at a time. One day in May of 1904, Jimmy slid into his schoolroom seat as usual, and Mr. Bills, the teacher, wasn't in the room. When he arrived there he was neatly dressed. There was an officer with him. "Boys, this is Major Mercer of the Carlisle Institute. He's traveling through the Indian Territory to choose students for Carlisle. He's looking over your records, and he wants to talk with several boys from this class. George Butler, you go first." George jumped up eagerly, and he left the room with the major. Carlisle! Jimmy could almost see before him Dr. Montezuma and Pop Warner and the All-American football players who had visited Haskell. What had Mr. Warner said? "We have teams in all different classes." Why, maybe I'll get a chance to go there, Jimmy thought. And in a few minutes, George returned. One after the other, 3 more boys were sent out. Jimmy's heart jumped each time a new name was called. There couldn't be many more. Mr. Bills looked at a list. "Now just one more. Jimmy Thorpe, will you go in now?" Jimmy wanted to shout, but he did not change his expression as he walked out of the room. "Jimmy Thorpe, you're the boy who was a promising athlete at Haskell, aren't you?" asked Major Mercer. Jimmy was startled. Why, yeah, I played a lot of games there." The major looked Jimmy over, and he noticed that the boy was small, but he had never seen a boy with better proportions for an athlete, and Jimmy had long arms and legs and strong shoulders. He had better muscles than most Indians, and they were not knotty or bunchy, but smooth and strong-looking. "Sit down, Jimmy," said the officer. "You've certainly got a good athletic build," he said. "It's not often I see a lad so evenly developed." Again, Jimmy looked so startled that the major laughed. "You may wonder why I'm talking about sports. You see, we're proud of our teams at Carlisle. We like to get good students, of course, and good athletes also." He looked at Jimmy's records. "Let's see. James Francis Thorpe. Height, 4 foot 10 inches, weight 115 pounds. It's too bad you're so small." The major went on reading. "Age 15, birthday May 28th, 1888. Why, you'll soon be 16. Huh, too bad. Well, we can't all be athletic stars." "Well, maybe I'll still grow," Jimmy said. "Well, that's not the most important thing. Anyway, let's see. Now, you went to the Sac and Fox Agency School, and then to Haskell, and then to here. You've done all right in your studies, and you've always done well when your farm work at school. Is that right?" "Yes, sir." "Have you any idea what you'd like to study if you came to Carlisle?" "We have many industrial departments." Jimmy was caught by surprise, and then suddenly he remembered that day he'd first seen the electric lights go on in Haskell. If those came from the new learning Paul talked about, maybe he could study that subject. Can I learn about electricity?" It was Major Mercer's turn to be surprised. "Well, that's an unusual request and very ambitious, but I'm afraid we don't have any classes in that yet. You could be a printer or a blacksmith or a painter or many other things. I don't know which. Well, you can make your choice later, Jimmy. You have a good record. I think you're a promising boy. If you want to come, we'd like to have you at Carlisle. Yes, sir. Jimmy was hardly able to hide his excitement, but of course an Indian could show no feelings before a stranger. He walked out of the office with his head in the clouds. Paul had been right. If you took one step at a time, you found your path, and one day it grew bright again. And oh, how bright it seemed now. At a place like Carlisle, he'd have a chance to prove whether he could be a great chief, a man like Paul, like the great Black Hawk, even Wethohuck was eager to try.